Devonte Washington was 38 years old, and until that Saturday morning, he believed his marriage was simply going through a rough season. He was a contractor, calloused hands, dusty boots, the kind of man who built things slowly and built them right. His wife Adrienne was polished, ambitious, and had long since stopped hiding her contempt for the life they shared. That morning, she sat across their kitchen table with a manila envelope and the composed expression of a woman who had already moved on. "My wife demanded a divorce because I was poor," her exact word, delivered without flinching, followed by a speech about diminishing returns and other women's husbands who had actually built something. She slid the papers toward him and waived any claim to the land his grandfather left, that worthless field 2 hours outside the city, because she couldn't imagine it mattered. What Adrienne didn't know was that 11 days earlier, Devonte had quietly closed a $4.2 million development agreement on those exact 100 acres. He looked at her signature on that waiver. Then he looked at her, and he said nothing. What came next would cost her everything she thought she'd already won. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Washington home as Devonte pulled his work truck into the driveway. His shoulders ached from a day of supervising concrete pours and checking structural alignments at the downtown renovation site. The familiar scent of sawdust and construction adhesive clung to his clothes, mixing with the sweat of an honest day's work. He paused at the front door, taking in the pristine landscaping Adrienne insisted on maintaining. Not because she enjoyed gardening, she hired professionals for that, but because appearances mattered in their neighborhood. Everything about their home was designed to impress others rather than create comfort. Inside, the house gleamed with the artificial perfection of a magazine spread. The hardwood floors reflected the overhead lights, like polished glass. Fresh flowers sat arranged in a crystal vase on the entryway table. Thursday was when the flower service made deliveries. The air carried the chemical sweetness of designer room spray. Adrienne stood in the kitchen, phone in hand, thumb scrolling rapidly across the screen. She wore a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her hair and makeup done with precision. She didn't look up when he entered. "Hey," Devonte said quietly, setting his keys in the ceramic dish by the door. The sound seemed too loud in the sterile silence. Adrienne responded, still focused on her phone. Her wedding ring caught the light as she typed, the diamond throwing tiny prisms on the marble countertop. The kitchen held the lingering aroma of the meal she'd prepared for herself. A single plate sat in the dish drainer, expertly washed and positioned to dry. The pots had already been cleaned and put away, leaving no trace of the cooking process. It was a routine he'd grown used to over the past year. Her silent dinners, his absent place setting. "Meeting tonight?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. There were always meetings, events, networking opportunities that required her presence, but never his. "Charity Auction Planning Committee," she replied flatly. Her tone carried the unspoken addition. "Nothing you'd be interested in." Devonte nodded and headed for the stairs, his work boots leaving faint traces on the immaculate floor. Tomorrow morning, the cleaning service would erase any evidence that a working man lived in this showcase home. He showered quickly, washing away the day's physical labor, while his mind wandered to the project that consumed his private hours. Changed into clean clothes, he made his way to the small home office that Adrienne referred to as his hobby room when speaking to her friends. The desk was organized chaos, strictly his domain since Adrienne never entered this space. Survey maps spread across the surface, marked with his careful notations. Zoning permits were stacked in chronological order, each representing months of methodical work. The wall held topographical drawings of his grandfather's land, the 100 acres that had prompted Adrienne's barely concealed disdain at Elmore's funeral. "A field with trees," she'd said then, her voice carrying that particular tone of polite dismissal she'd perfected over the years. "At least property taxes are low on undeveloped land." Devante powered up his laptop, the screen illuminating with the development spreadsheet he'd been refining for 3 years. Each tab represented a phase of the project: environmental impact studies, utility access negotiations, infrastructure planning, commercial zoning applications. The final tab showed the partnership agreement with Whitfield Commercial Group, signed and executed last week. He studied the numbers that would change everything: $4.2 million upfront payment, plus a 20% retained equity stake in the development project. His grandfather's field with trees would soon become a mixed-use commercial and residential complex, transforming worthless rural acreage into generational wealth. The sound of Adrienne's heels clicking across the foyer floor drifted up to his office. The front door opened and closed. Her car engine started, then faded as she drove away to her meeting, leaving him alone in their perfect, empty house. Devante sat in the growing darkness, listening to the silence. He thought about his grandfather, about the quiet pride Elmore took in paying off those 100 acres over decades of careful saving. He thought about the lessons his father taught him about patience, about the value of land, about the wisdom of letting others underestimate you. The laptop screen dimmed automatically from inactivity. Devante closed it without saving any changes. Everything important was already locked in place. He made himself a simple dinner from leftovers, ate alone at the pristine kitchen island, and washed his dishes until they gleamed. Later, he lay in their king-sized bed, the expensive sheets cool against his skin. Adrienne came home late, slipping under the covers without a word. She settled on her side, her back a wall between them, her breathing soon evening into sleep. Devante stared at the ceiling, surrounded by all the carefully curated trappings of the life she'd chosen, the life she'd decided wasn't enough. Saturday morning arrived with deceptive calm. The hardware store's familiar fluorescent lighting and endless aisles of tools had provided Devante a moment of normalcy, picking up supplies for a client's bathroom renovation, checking his material list twice, exchanging nods with the regular weekend contractors. He pulled into his driveway at 9:30, the paper bag of plumbing fixtures rattling in the passenger seat. Adrienne's car was still there, which was unusual for a Saturday. She typically spent weekends at brunches or charity planning sessions, building the social network she considered crucial to their future, or rather, her future. The house felt different when he stepped inside. There was a weight to the silence, an intentional quality to the stillness. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, catching dust motes in its beam, illuminating Adrienne where she sat at their granite-topped island. Her posture was perfect, hands folded on the surface before her. A manila envelope lay between her carefully manicured fingers. She wore what he recognized as her client presentation outfit, a cream-colored blazer over a silk shell, pearl earrings catching the light. Her makeup was flawless, her expression composed with the same precision she brought to her corporate events. This was a performance she had rehearsed. "We should talk," she said, her voice carrying that practiced blend of firmness and false compassion she used when delivering difficult news to vendors who hadn't met her standards. Devante set the hardware store bag on the counter. The sound of metal fittings clinking against each other seemed too loud in the charged atmosphere. He didn't sit. "About what?" She slid the manila envelope forward with 2 fingers, as if distancing herself from its contents even as she presented them. "I've been thinking about our future, about what we both deserve." Her tone was measured, each word selected for maximum impact with minimum mess. "I've had my attorney draw up dissolution papers." The word dissolution hung in the air between them. Clinical, sterile, like their marriage was a business arrangement being terminated for lack of profitability. "I've tried, Devante. I've really tried to make this work." Her voice carried the rehearsed cadence of someone who had practiced this speech in private. "But I can't keep pretending that this life is enough. That watching my friends' husbands build real wealth while we stay stuck in the same place is acceptable." She gestured at the envelope. "I've made it simple. Clean. I keep the house. I found it. I decorated it. I maintained it. You keep your truck, your tools, the equipment yard you lease. I've even reviewed that land your grandfather left you." Her lip curled slightly at the mention of the inheritance. "Given its assessed value, or lack thereof, I'm formally waiving any claim to it. You can keep your field with trees." Devante felt something massive and seismic move through him. Grief came first, not for the marriage ending, but for the years spent building something with someone who had already decided its worth. Rage followed, a quiet fire that burned not at her betrayal, but at her arrogance. And underneath both emotions, something cooler and clearer emerged, a crystalline understanding that this moment was both an ending and a beginning. He picked up the envelope, but didn't open it. "I'll need to review these with an attorney." Adrienne blinked, the first crack in her composure. She had expected argument, tears, perhaps, or immediate capitulation. His calm response disrupted her carefully planned script. "The terms are very straightforward. We could handle this today." "I'll review them with an attorney," he repeated, his voice level. He turned and walked to his office, the envelope heavy in his hand. Once alone, Devante sat at his desk, the same desk where the development plans lay carefully hidden in a locked drawer. He opened the envelope and began reading, his contractor's habit of checking every detail serving him well now. The standard legal language washed over him until he reached page 4. The asset disclosure section listed Adrienne's personal property, including bank accounts and investments. His eyes caught on an entry he didn't recognize, a joint investment account opened 18 months ago, an account with 2 names on it. The second name wasn't his. Devante stared at the paper, at the unfamiliar name listed as co-holder on an account he never knew existed. The sunlight continued to stream through his office window, painting patterns on the divorce papers that would end his 7-year marriage. The evening stretched long shadows across Devante's home office when Curtis's truck rumbled into the driveway. Devante heard the familiar heavy tread of his younger brother's work boots on the porch steps, followed by 3 sharp knocks, Curtis's signature rhythm since they were kids. "It's open," Devante called, not looking up from the papers spread across his desk. Curtis filled the doorway, still in his electrician's uniform, concern etched deep in his features. "Got here as fast as I could, brother." "What's going on?" Devante gestured to the chair across from his desk. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across the documents, divorce papers on one side, a printed bank statement on the other. Curtis sat, his usual energy contained but barely. "Adrienne served me divorce papers this morning," Devante said, his voice steady. "But that's not why I called you." He slid the bank statement across the desk. "Remember how she insisted we file taxes jointly that first year? Used our shared tax ID for some accounts?" Curtis leaned forward, squinting at the paper. "Yeah? She forgot about that? Or didn't think I'd look?" Devante tapped the statement with one finger. "Found this account linked to our old joint filing. 14 months of regular deposits. Amounts that don't match her salary pattern." Curtis's eyes narrowed as he studied the numbers. "Where's this money coming from?" "Brandon Okafor." Devante watched his brother's face darken. "Real estate developer. Does a lot of work downtown. High-end commercial properties, luxury condos." Curtis's chair scraped back as he stood, his hands clenching into fists. "That's why she's been at all those networking events? All those late nights?" His voice rose. "I'll show that suit-wearing Sit down." Devante's tone was quiet, but carried enough authority to stop Curtis mid-stride. "I need you to be useful right now. Not angry. Useful." Curtis struggled visibly with the command, but slowly lowered himself back into the chair. "Talk to me, then." Devante laid out the situation with methodical precision. The affair, the timeline, the divorce paper, the deliberate waiver of the land. As he spoke, he pulled out another document, the development agreement with Whitfield Commercial Group. The land she's so graciously waiving? Devante slid the agreement across the desk. Read the numbers on page 3. Curtis's eyes widened as he read, then reread the figures. 4.2 million, plus equity stake? His voice cracked. Brother, when did you— 3 years of quiet work, Devante said. Environmental studies, zoning changes, utility access negotiations. Signed the final agreement last week. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. 11 days before she served me papers. Curtis let out a low whistle, shaking his head. She has no idea, does she? She thought she was being clever, Devante replied. Waiving claim to worthless property before the development value could be established. But she moved too late. The deal's already closed, so what's the play? Curtis leaned forward, his anger now channeled into focus. Devante laid out his plan with the same precision he'd used to develop the land. We let her proceed exactly as she intends. I sign nothing until every asset is properly disclosed. I retain the right attorney, and I make sure her decision to dismiss that land becomes the most expensive choice she's ever made. No confrontation? No calling her out? Patience isn't passive, Curtis. Devante's voice carried the weight of certainty. It's a weapon, if you know how to use it. They spent the next hour reviewing documents, Curtis making calls to contacts who might know more about Brandon Okafor's business dealings. When Curtis finally left, the night had settled fully around the house. Devante moved from his desk to the old recliner in the corner, his grandfather Elmore's favorite chair, the one piece of furniture he'd insisted on keeping from the family home. He reached for the photograph on the side table. Elmore Washington, standing proud on those 100 acres, grinning like a man who knew exactly what he was leaving behind. The sun in the picture caught his grandfather's face at an angle that highlighted the quiet satisfaction in his expression. You knew, didn't you? Devante spoke softly to the photograph. You knew what that land could become. You just needed someone patient enough to see it through. He sat in the familiar comfort of his grandfather's chair, holding the photograph, feeling the weight of legacy and vindication settling around him like a mantle. The morning light filtered through the downtown office windows as Devante sat across from Gwen Mercer. Her office spoke of precision, everything aligned at right angles, not a paper out of place. She was exactly what the Whitfield firm's legal team had described, sharp, direct, and entirely focused on the documents spread between them. Walk me through the timeline again, she said, pen poised over her legal pad. Devante laid out each element methodically. The development agreement with Whitfield Commercial Group closed 11 days ago. $4.2 million up front, plus retained equity stake in the final build-out. He placed the contract on her desk. My wife served divorce papers yesterday morning, specifically waiving any claim to what she called non-income producing inherited property. Gwen's expression didn't change, but her pen moved faster. The land inheritance? Solely in your name? Yes. From my grandfather, Elmore Washington. Never commingled with marital assets. Kept the title clean deliberately. She nodded, making another note. That works in our favor. Inherited property, maintained separately, carries strong legal protection. The development agreement is more complex since it was executed during the marriage, but her explicit waiver creates an interesting tactical advantage. Devante placed the bank statements next. There's more. Found this account linked to our old joint tax ID. 14 months of regular deposits from Brandon Okafor. Gwen studied the numbers, her eyes narrowing slightly. The affair partner? Real estate developer. Downtown properties. Luxury developments. His phone buzzed. A text from Curtis, who was cross-referencing dates with his contacts. Devante read it and felt something cold settle in his chest. He looked up at Gwen. Need to add something to the timeline, he said quietly. My brother just confirmed it. Adrienne opened that joint account with Brandon 2 months before she started pushing me to sell the land. Gwen's pen stopped. Explain. 18 months ago, we got an offer on the property. Well below market value, even for undeveloped land. Adrienne insisted I take it, called the land a liability, a tax burden, a distraction. Devante's voice remained steady, but his hands had tightened slightly on the armrest. I refused. She dropped it. I thought that was the end. But the account predates the offer, Gwen said, connecting the dots. Brandon's a developer. He must have recognized the potential, done some preliminary research. The lowball offer was their first play. Devante laid out the sequence. When I wouldn't sell, the strategy shifted. Instead of helping steal the asset, she'd divorce me before its value was officially established. Missing the closing by 11 days, Gwen finished, shaking her head slightly. It wasn't an affair of passion, Devante said, the realization settling into his bones. It was calculation. Every step. Gwen studied him for a moment, then pulled out a fresh legal pad. Here's what we're going to do. First, we prepare a complete financial disclosure. Every asset, every account, every development projection. We document the inherited nature of the land and its careful separation from marital assets. We highlight the timeline of her account with Mr. Okafor, particularly its establishment before the attempted land sale. She wrote as she spoke, her handwriting precise as her thinking. We move quietly. We let her believe her strategy is working. When we respond to the divorce petition, we do it with full documentation of your actual asset position. The development agreement, the property appraisals, everything. What's our primary protection for the development rights? Devante asked. The inheritance laws are clear. The land itself is protected. The development agreement's timing creates some exposure, but her explicit waiver of the property, combined with the documented separation of assets, gives us strong positioning. Gwen looked up from her notes. Most importantly, we have leverage she doesn't know exists yet. Devante nodded, taking in the strategy. The betrayal's cold calculation had crystallized something in him. Begin preparing the financial disclosure, he said. I want every detail documented, every number clear. When this lands, I want there to be no room for misunderstanding exactly what she tried to throw away. Gwen started organizing the documents into separate files, her movements efficient and purposeful. We'll need statements from Whitfield confirming the development agreement's terms, bank records showing the land's separate maintenance, property tax history under your sole name. The morning light had shifted, casting long rectangles across her desk as they worked through each element of the disclosure. Every piece of paper felt like another brick in the foundation of consequence that Devante was carefully constructing, as methodical in this as he had been with the land development itself. Curtis's truck pulled into Devante's driveway as the evening shadows lengthened across the lawn. He carried a manila folder thick with papers, his expression grim as Devante led him into the home office. You need to see this, Curtis said, spreading documents across Devante's desk. Got some people who know people in Brandon's development circles. Man's got a pattern. Devante sat, examining the papers with the same careful attention he gave to building specifications, news clippings, court records, social media screenshots, pieces of a larger picture emerging. 2 years ago, Curtis began, pointing to a legal filing, Brandon dated Margaret Chen. She was married to a restaurant owner, left her husband, invested $800,000 in Brandon's downtown development project. He tapped another document. Project went under. Money gone. Devante studied the numbers, his expression unchanged. Year before that, Curtis continued, sliding forward another set of papers, Sarah Martinez, also married, also left her husband, put $600,000 into one of Brandon's projects. He shook his head. Same story. Project failed. Money disappeared. Pattern. Devante said quietly. "Man's got a method," Curtis agreed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He finds women who are married, usually to men with assets or potential assets, gets close through charity events, business functions, makes them feel like they settled for less than they deserve. Then he helps them plan their exit." Devante leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information with the same stillness he'd maintained since finding the joint account. "Not random," he observed. "Strategic. These women weren't accidents," Curtis pressed. "They were targets. And Adrienne is following the same script," Devante finished. The sound of kitchen cabinets opening drifted through the closed office door. Adrienne was home, moving around the kitchen with unusual energy. The smell of cooking filled the house, something that hadn't happened in months. "She's been different since serving the papers," Devante said, his voice low. Lighter, almost happy. Curtis's jaw tightened. "Because she thinks she's winning. This morning, she suggested we handle things like adults. Twice. Now she's cooking dinner." Devante gestured at the door. "First time in 3 months, she's made enough for both of us. Playing nice while she thinks she's ahead," Curtis growled. "Man, we should do nothing," Devante cut in, calm but firm. "The moment she realizes I'm not as blind as she thinks, she becomes dangerous. Right now, her confidence is our advantage." A knock at the office door. Adrian's voice, warm in a way it hadn't been in years. "Dinner's ready." "I made enough for everyone if Curtis wants to stay." Curtis started to refuse, but Devante gave him a look. "We'd like that," Devante called back. "Thank you." They moved to the dining room where Adrian had set 3 places. All the good dishes, wine glasses, everything arranged with careful attention. She'd made pot roast, Devante's favorite from early in their marriage. "I thought it would be nice," she said, serving portions with practiced grace, "since we're all being so mature about everything." Curtis's hand tightened on his fork, but Devante remained relaxed, his posture open and neutral. "It looks wonderful," he said. Throughout dinner, Adrian maintained a steady stream of light conversation, work events, mutual friends, comfortable topics that carefully avoided any mention of divorce papers or property division. She smiled often, refilled wine glasses, played the perfect hostess. "I really hope we can keep things amicable," she said, touching Devante's arm briefly. "You've always been so reasonable. I know we can handle this like adults." Devante noted the touch, the careful word choice, the performance of goodwill. He responded with polite smiles and neutral comments, giving her nothing to interpret. No anger to justify her actions, no warmth to exploit, no hint that he understood exactly what game was being played. Curtis watched the exchange with barely concealed tension, but followed his brother's lead. They finished dinner with pleasant small talk and measured responses. When the plates were cleared, Devante thanked Adrian for cooking. His voice was cordial, neither cold nor warm, the same tone he might use with a casual acquaintance. He excused himself to his office, where Gwen's preliminary filings waited for review. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing him away from the sound of Adrian humming in the kitchen, the satisfied tune of someone who believed they had everything under control. Devante sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of organized paperwork, asset listings, property assessments, development projections. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room when his phone lit up with an unexpected name, Paulette Holloway. He hadn't spoken to Adrian's mother since the divorce papers were served. Their relationship had always been warm but respectful, the kind built on quiet understanding rather than forced familiarity. He answered on the second ring. "Devante?" Paulette's voice carried its usual composure, but something underneath felt strained. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Never for you, Paulette." He set down his pen. "What can I do for you?" A pause stretched between them. When she spoke again, her words came carefully measured. "I heard through Regina. You know how my sister talks. that Adrienne initiated divorce proceedings. That's correct. I'm not calling to interfere, Paulette said quickly. That's not my place. I'm calling because something has been bothering me for weeks, and after hearing about the divorce, she took a breath. 2 months ago, I attended the Children's Hospital fundraiser. Adrienne was there, working the event. Devante listened, his expression unchanged. She introduced me to several people that night, including a man named Brandon Okafor. She called him a colleague. Paulette's voice tightened slightly. He was very familiar with her, comfortable. But that's not why I'm calling, she continued. Later that evening, I overheard him speaking to another developer. He didn't know who I was. Adrienne had only introduced me as Paulette, not as her mother. He made a comment about Adrienne's situation being almost resolved. The words hung in the air between them. Devante's hand rested flat on his desk, perfectly still. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, Paulette said softly. But now, Devante, I need you to know something. These past few months, Adrienne has been telling stories within the family that you were absent, uninvolved, that you had checked out of the marriage years ago and she was carrying everything alone. Devante closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of this new layer of betrayal. I never believed it. Paulette's voice was firm now. Not for a moment. I watched how you treated her, how you built your life together. I saw the way you managed your business, careful, methodical, always thinking ahead. The story she was telling, it never matched the man I knew. Thank you, Paulette. Devante kept his voice steady, though something in his chest ached. That means more than you know. I'm ashamed, she said quietly. Not just of what she's doing, but that she thought she could make us believe you were something you're not. I raised her better than this. You did, Devante agreed softly. This isn't on you. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Paulette spoke again. I won't take sides publicly. She's still my daughter. But I needed you to know. Whatever story she's telling, whatever narrative she's building, at least one person in this family sees it for what it is. I understand. And he did. The impossible position she was in. The pain of watching your child make choices you never taught them to make. Take care of yourself, Devante. After the call ended, Devante sat motionless at his desk. The betrayal had expanded beyond the boundaries of their marriage, touching people who should have been safely outside its blast radius. Paulette shouldn't have had to make that call. She shouldn't have had to choose between loyalty to truth and loyalty to her daughter. He picked up his phone again and dialed Gwen Mercer's office number. I need everything accelerated, he said when she answered. The full disclosure package. I want it finalized and filed within the week. That's aggressive timing, Gwen noted. Any particular reason? Yes. He looked at the family photo still sitting on his desk. Him and Adrienne at last year's Christmas dinner, Paulette standing between them, smiling. The story needs to be corrected before it gets told too many more times. He spent the next hour completing the final documentation Gwen needed, signing each page with careful precision. When the last form was finished, he drove out to the development site alone. The 100 acres stretched dark and quiet under the evening sky. Devante walked the perimeter slowly, his boots crunching on gravel and fallen leaves. The land felt different now, no longer just his grandfather's legacy, but the pivot point around which everything was turning. He touched the old fence posts as he passed, the way his grandfather used to. The property markers glowed faintly in his flashlight beam, marking boundaries that would soon transform from simple plot lines into something much more valuable, something Adrienne had never bothered to understand. The morning light filtered through Devante's office window as he sorted through another stack of documents. Gwen's office had sent an urgent request for all active insurance policies, standard procedure for the marital asset disclosure. But something about the timing felt significant. He pulled open his filing cabinet, methodically removing folders labeled with different policy types: health, auto, business liability, property. Each one familiar, each one authorized by his signature. The documentation was organized with the precision of a man who understood that details matter. His phone buzzed. A text from Gwen. "Need those policies by noon. Everything active. No exception." Devante reached for the last folder when a thin envelope caught his eye, tucked behind the others. He didn't recognize it. The paper was crisp, recent, not the weathered edges of his older policies. Opening it carefully, he began to read. The first page showed a life insurance policy. His name was listed as the insured party, but the signature authorizing it wasn't his. Adrienne's name appeared as the sole beneficiary. The policy value jumped off the page. $800,000. He checked the date. 18 months ago. 3 months after Adrienne had pushed him to sell the land. 3 months after he'd refused. Devante's hands, usually steady with any document, trembled slightly. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was something darker. Something that turned the air in his quiet office cold. He traced the premium payment records. Small, regular withdrawals from their shared household account. Amounts that would blend seamlessly with utility bills and grocery purchases. Calculated. Invisible, unless you knew to look. For 15 minutes, he sat completely still. The policy laid flat on his desk. The sunlight that had seemed warm earlier now felt harsh, exposing. This wasn't just an exit strategy. Wasn't just Adrienne choosing Brandon over their marriage. This was a contingency plan. A backup option if the primary plan failed. His phone buzzed again. Curtis this time. "Stopping by with those contractor estimates you wanted." Devante texted back one word. "Come." When Curtis arrived 20 minutes later, Devante wordlessly handed him the policy. He watched his brother's face as understanding dawned. Watched the color drain. Watched his hands clench into fists. Curtis read it twice, 3 times. His breathing got heavier with each pass. When he finally looked up, his eyes were dark with a fury Devante hadn't seen since they were teenagers. "I'm going to—" Curtis started, already moving toward the door. Devante stepped in front of him, one hand raised. His voice was quiet, but absolute. "No. Dev, she took out a policy on your life. After trying to get you to sell that land. You can't tell me. Every move she made." Devante cut in, still calm, still measured. "She made in darkness, every single one. She did it because she was certain I wasn't watching." He took the policy from Curtis's shaking hands. "But I am watching now. This isn't something you just file away." "The disclosure meeting is already scheduled," Devante said. "Everything lands there. All of it." He gathered the policy and the rest of the insurance documentation into a clean folder. Curtis paced the office, trying to burn off the rage Devante wouldn't let him act on. Within the hour, Devante was in Gwen's office. She reviewed the policy with her usual professional detachment, but her pen pressed harder into the legal pad as she made notes. "Say nothing to Adrienne about this," she advised, adding the policy to a separate file. "This kind of documentation, it changes the tone of everything." Devante nodded. Back in his office, he made one final call to James Whitfield at the development firm. The call connected immediately. "James? It's Devante Washington. I need a favor." He explained the situation in broad strokes. Divorce proceedings, potential challenges to the development agreement, the importance of having everything properly documented. "Would you be willing to attend one meeting in person? Just to confirm the deal structure and ownership?" "Of course," Whitfield replied without hesitation. "You know I've always appreciated how you handle business, Devante. Clean, thorough, no corners cut. Just tell me when and where." Evening shadows stretched across Devante's home office as he stood at the window, watching the last traces of sunlight fade from the manicured lawn. The house was quiet. Too quiet, really. The kind of quiet that reminded him how temporary everything was now. This house that Adrienne wanted to claim, with its gleaming hardwood floors and carefully curated decor, felt more like a museum of their failed marriage than a home. He could see his reflection in the window glass, superimposed over the darkening yard. 7 years of marriage had left their mark, but not in the way most people would expect. He hadn't grown bitter or angry. He'd grown precise, patient. The quiet man in the room who everyone underestimated had been building something all along, brick by careful brick. His grandfather Elmore's words echoed in his mind. Land holds value, son, but patience? Patience is priceless. He remembered countless Sunday afternoons walking those 100 acres with the old man, listening to stories about how each piece had been acquired, how the family legacy had been built through careful planning and unwavering determination. On his desk, the final documentation from Gwen's office lay spread out in meticulous order. The formal response to Adrienne's divorce petition was a masterpiece of timing and precision. Every page had been carefully prepared, every detail verified, every asset properly valued. The Whitfield Commercial Group agreement sat at the center. $4.2 million in immediate equity, with projected development stakes that would multiply that number significantly. Devante picked up his phone and opened the email from Gwen confirming tomorrow's schedule. She had orchestrated everything perfectly. James Whitfield would arrive early for their agreement protection meeting, ensuring his presence in the building exactly when Adrienne walked through those doors. The timing wasn't accidental. Nothing about tomorrow would be accidental. He reviewed the insurance policy notation one more time, his jaw tightening slightly at the sight of those premium payments drawn so carefully from their shared account. The affair timeline was laid out in stark detail. Every deposit, every meeting, every calculated move documented with banker's precision. The asset disclosure was comprehensive, leaving no room for later claims of oversight or confusion. Running his hand across the smooth surface of his grandfather's old desk, the one piece of furniture he'd insisted on keeping in the office despite Adrienne's subtle attempts to replace it, Devante thought about the cost of being underestimated. Years of quiet work, of letting people assume his silence meant acceptance, of watching Adrienne's thinly veiled contempt grow while he built something she never bothered to see. The house creaked softly in the growing darkness, familiar sounds that would soon belong to someone else's evening routine. But unlike the house, unlike the carefully maintained image Adrienne had crafted of their life together, the land was his alone, his grandfather's legacy, protected and transformed through his own vision and work, would never be part of her exit strategy. Devante picked up his phone again, composing a message to Adrienne with deliberate care. We should meet at the attorney's office together. I have some things I'd like to discuss in person. The response came almost immediately, a single thumbs-up emoji. He could almost see her satisfied smile, the confidence of someone who believed they had already won the game. She would be thinking about the house, about her carefully constructed narrative, about the clean break she thought she had orchestrated. The blue light of his phone screen illuminated his face in the darkened office as he set it down. Everything was in place now. Tomorrow would bring its own kind of quiet, not the silence of patience, but the stillness before consequence. Moving with the same unhurried precision that had defined his entire approach, Devante gathered the documents into their folders. Each paper represented a piece of the truth Adrienne had never bothered to learn, each file a chapter in the story she thought she was controlling. His hand paused over the light switch. For a moment, he looked around the office one last time, at the desk that had been his grandfather's, at the window where he'd stood so many evenings planning and building, at the space where he'd learned that patience wasn't weakness, but power. The light clicked off, leaving only the faint glow of street lamps filtering through the window. For the first time in weeks, as he walked toward his bedroom, Devante felt the weight of insomnia lifting. Tonight, sleep would come easily. Tomorrow would take care of itself. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Gwen Mercer's law office, casting long rectangles of light across the polished conference table. Adrienne walked in like she owned the room, her heels clicking purposefully against the hardwood floor. Her attorney, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, followed close behind. The confidence in her posture, the slight lift of her chin, everything about her screamed certainty. Devante was already seated beside Gwen, his posture relaxed but alert. He watched Adrienne take her seat, noting how she barely glanced his way. She was wearing the navy blue dress she always chose for important meetings, her jewelry understated but clearly expensive. It was her power outfit, the one she wore when she wanted to project authority. Gwen's associate, a young woman in a crisp blazer, began distributing thick manila envelopes around the table. The sound of paper sliding across polished wood seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. Adrienne's perfectly manicured nails tapped once against the table before she reached for her copy. Her attorney opened his first, as lawyers tend to do. His eyes moved across the first page with professional detachment. Then he reached the asset disclosure section. His eyebrows lifted slightly, the first crack in his composed expression. He turned to the second page, and his hand stilled completely. "Is there something wrong?" Adrienne asked, her voice carrying that same note of polite condescension she'd perfected over years of corporate events. Her attorney said nothing, just kept reading. Adrienne opened her own copy. The change in her expression happened in stages. First came confusion, as she saw the Whitfield Commercial Group Development Agreement. Then disbelief as she registered the numbers, $4.2 million in immediate equity. Her lips parted slightly as she turned to page 2. Projected development stake valued between $3.8 and $6 million at build-out. The color drained from her face so completely that her carefully applied blush stood out like fever spots on her cheeks. Gwen cleared her throat softly. "Let me walk you through the legal framework here." Her voice was clear and professional, almost academic in its precision. The land in question was inherited solely by Mr. Washington from his grandfather. It was never commingled with marital assets. The deed remained exclusively in his name throughout the marriage. Adrienne's hands trembled slightly as she turned another page. "Furthermore," Gwen continued, "your own filed petition specifically waives any interest in, and I quote, non-income producing inherited real property." That language, combined with the asset's origin and management, creates a very clear legal picture. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the usual office sounds, phones ringing, distant conversations, the hum of the ventilation system, seemed muted, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "There's one other matter we need to address," Gwen said, reaching for another document. "During our asset review, we discovered this insurance policy." She slid it across the table. Adrienne's attorney picked it up first, his expression growing more concerned with each line he read. "A policy taken out 18 months ago," Gwen noted, "with premiums drawn from the household account. Mr. Washington was never informed of its existence." Adrienne's face, already pale, took on an ashen quality. For the first time since she'd walked into the office, real fear showed in her eyes. "We're not making any accusations," Gwen said smoothly. "We're simply noting its existence and timing for the legal record." The room fell silent again. Adrienne's attorney leaned over to whisper something in her ear, but she didn't seem to hear him. She was staring at the documents in front of her like they were written in a language she couldn't quite understand. Then Devante spoke. His voice was calm, measured, the same tone he might use discussing blueprint specifications with a client. "I know about Brandon," he said simply. "I know when it started. I know about the pressure to sell the land 18 months ago. I know everything." Adrienne's hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white. I'm not interested in revenge. Devante continued. I want a fair accounting. Nothing more, nothing less. We'll do this properly, without theater. The house will be assessed at market value. Assets will be divided according to law. And then we'll be done. Before Adrienne could respond, her attorney was already gathering their papers, clearly eager to regroup and reassess their position. They stood together, Adrienne moving like someone in a daze. As they walked out of the conference room, James Whitfield was standing in the lobby, early for his separate meeting. His face lit up when he saw Devante. "Devante Washington!" he called out warmly, extending his hand. "Can't wait to break ground next week." Adrienne froze mid-step. She turned slowly, watching as her husband, the man she'd dismissed as unambitious, as beneath her, shook hands with one of the city's most prominent developers. The reality of what she'd walked away from seemed to hit her all at once. Without another word, she walked out of the building, her heels no longer clicking with quite the same confidence. Devante watched her go, then turned back to Gwen, ready to move forward with the next steps. 2 weeks after the disclosure meeting, Curtis arrived at Devante's temporary apartment, his expression grim. He'd been working his contacts in Brandon's professional circle, piecing together what happened after Adrienne learned the land deal had closed. 5 days, Curtis said, settling into a chair at Devante's kitchen table. That's how long it took him to ghost her completely. Devante looked up from his coffee, waiting for the rest. She called, texted, showed up at his office twice. Curtis shook his head. Then he sent her a message, just one. Said they'd run their course. That was it. Man didn't even call. Devante absorbed this quietly. The woman who had dismantled their marriage, who had calculated and planned for over a year, was left with nothing but a text message. The divorce finalized 4 months after the disclosure meeting. The paperwork was clean, clinical. Every asset properly valued and divided. Devante retained full ownership of the development agreement and equity stake. The house sold at fair market value. Adrienne received her assessed share of the marital assets. It would cover a year's rent in a decent apartment, nothing more. The insurance policy remained an unspoken weight. Her attorney had advised against contesting anything related to it. The legal notation would stay on record. One evening, about 2 weeks after the divorce was final, Paulette called Devante. Adrienne had arranged a family dinner at her parents' home, her last attempt at controlling the narrative. "She's telling everyone you hid assets," Paulette said wearily. "That you deceived her about the land's value. I think you should know what's being said." The dinner itself was tense from the start. Adrienne sat at her parents' familiar dining table, perfectly composed in another expensive outfit, speaking with practiced emotion about how wronged she felt. Her sister Rochelle watched silently. Paulette's hands were tight around her water glass. "He concealed everything," Adrienne insisted, her voice carrying that same rehearsed hurt from the divorce filing. "The development deal, the real value." "Stop!" Everyone turned to Paulette. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. "I met Brandon at that charity event," Paulette said evenly. "I heard what he said about your situation. I know the timeline, Adrienne. I know exactly what happened and when." She looked directly at her daughter. "I love you. You are my child. But I will not sit here and listen to you cast Devante as the villain of a story you wrote yourself." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Rochelle, who had barely spoken all evening, asked softly, "Did you ever actually love him?" Adrienne opened her mouth, closed it, said nothing. The dinner ended shortly after. 6 months passed. Brandon Okafor's name appeared in a financial publication, a civil suit filed by a previous investor. His professional reputation began to quietly erode. Another woman came forward with a similar story. The pattern emerged. On the morning construction officially began, Devante drove out to the land alone. The sun was just coming up. painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. He walked all 100 acres the way his grandfather Elmore used, slowly, deliberately, reading the ground with each step. Survey markers dotted the landscape, holding the Earth's promise in bright orange flags. He touched each fence post, remembering how Elmore used to do the same. Then he called Curtis. His brother arrived 20 minutes later. They stood together as the sun dropped, watching long shadows stretch across what would soon be transformed. Neither spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. Later that week, Devante met Paulette for lunch at a quiet cafe downtown. She asked how he was doing. Really doing. He told her the truth. He was good. Genuinely good. She reached into her purse and slid a business card across the table. "Sarah Chen," she said. "She's the landscape architect who did the early site planning. Asked about you specifically." Devante picked up the card, turning it over in his hands. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside him. Real, genuine, the first in what felt like years. The skyline stretched beyond the cafe window, glass towers catching the midday sun. His grandfather never lived to see it, but somehow Devante knew Elmore had always known it was coming. He pocketed the card and headed back to the site. Back to the land. Back to what was always his. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.